The dust settled on Elias McCrae's shoulders like a shroud. It coated the brim of his hat, worked its way into the lines around his eyes, and clung to the worn leather of his chaps. For 2 years, since Sarah's death, the dust had been his most constant companion. It was the taste of his land, the scent of his grief, a fine grit in the machinery of his life that was slowly grinding to a halt. His ranch, once a place of shared dreams, was now just a collection of chores under a relentless Wyoming sky. The fences sagged, the paint on the small clapboard house had peeled away to reveal the weary gray wood beneath. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, cracked and thirsty, mirroring the drought in his own soul. He worked from before the sun rose until his muscles screamed in the twilight, but the work never filled the hollowness Sarah had left behind. It was Sheriff Brody who brought the trouble to his door. Though the whispers had been circulating in the town of Redemption for months, Brody was a man whose considerable bulk was matched only by the weight of his self-importance. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and surveyed the property with a critical eye. "McCrae," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. The town council had another meeting. Elias leaned against a fence post, not offering the sheriff a seat on the porch he no longer bothered to sweep. And your name came up. Again. Brody hitched his thumbs in his belt, puffing out his chest. "It's been 2 years since your wife passed. God rest her soul. The council feels, well, they feel a man living alone on a spread this size, without a woman's touch, is an unstable situation." Elias's jaw tightened. He knew what this was about. Redemption was a town built on piety and judgment in equal measure. They prided themselves on being a bastion of moral fortitude, a clean spot in a wild territory. The Widower's Settlement Clause, as it was unofficially known, was a piece of local legislation designed to keep the town's character pure. It stated that a man who lost his wife had a grace period of 2 years to remarry and demonstrate a stable, Christian household. If he failed, the council could review his land grant, deeming him at risk of falling into drink, despair, or, worst of all, turning his property into a haven for the sort of riffraff and painted ladies who operated on the outskirts of more lenient territories. It was a land grab dressed up in a preacher's collar. "I'm stable enough," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly. "That's not what they see," Brody countered, gesturing vaguely at the quiet house. "They see a man wasting away. They see a prime piece of land bordering the river, and they hear whispers about men like Dutch Hogan looking to expand their enterprises. Hogan ran the largest saloon and a string of backroom businesses that the council publicly condemned and privately profited from. The clause is there to protect the town's virtue. Elias, to prevent a good man's home from becoming a brothel." The insult was a hot poker to Elias's gut. That they would mention Sarah's home in the same breath as a whorehouse made his hands clench into fists. "This is my land. Sarah is buried on this land." "And we want to keep it that way," the sheriff said, his tone softening with false sympathy. "All you need to do is settle down again. Find a respectable woman. Show the council you're a family man, not a hermit on the verge of collapse. You've got 3 months. Elias, after that, they'll start the proceedings." Brody mounted his horse, leaving Elias alone with the dust and the ultimatum. 3 months. He looked at the house Sarah had made a home, at the small, fenced-off plot on the hill where she lay. He would not lose this place. It was all he had left of her. He would rather swallow poison than bring another woman into Sarah's kitchen, to sleep in Sarah's bed. But the law had him in a chokehold. His solution was as desperate and pragmatic as the man himself. He rode into Cheyenne the next week and paid for a small, discreet advertisement in the territorial newspaper. The wording was stark, stripped of all sentiment. "Widowed rancher seeks a respectable woman of good character to act as bride for appearances. Room and board provided, modest stipend. Duties include maintaining a Christian household and attending church. This is a business arrangement only. Discretion assured and expected. Inquire by letter to Box 7, Redemption, Wyoming." He expected ridicule. or perhaps no response at all. But a week later, a single letter arrived. The penmanship was elegant, a series of delicate loops and fine lines that seemed out of place on the cheap paper. It was brief and to the point. To the widowed rancher, I am a woman of good character who finds herself in need of a respectable position. I am versed in all duties required to maintain a household. I understand the nature of a business arrangement and can promise both discretion and a convincing performance. I am available to travel at once. Sincerely, Miss Clara Hale. There was something in the crisp, formal tone that appealed to Elias's own unsentimental nature. A convincing performance was exactly what he needed. After a brief exchange of letters confirming the terms and wiring travel money, it was settled. He knew nothing about her, except that her name was Clara Hale, and she was coming on the Tuesday stagecoach. He told himself it was better that way. She was not a wife, she was a necessity, a tool to keep his land. The stagecoach kicked up a cloud of brown dust as it rattled to a stop in front of the Redemption General Store. A few townsfolk paused their errands, curious to see who was arriving in their quiet corner of the world. Elias stood apart, his hat pulled low. When the door opened, she was not what he expected. He had pictured someone plain, perhaps a spinster, hardened by life and grateful for any offer. The woman who stepped down was elegant, even in a simple, dark traveling dress, worn and mended but impeccably clean. She carried herself with a straight-backed pride that seemed to defy the dust and the gawking onlookers. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned up in a neat chignon, though loose strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and fine-boned. She was beautiful, but it was a fragile, wounded kind of beauty, most notable in her eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they scanned the small crowd with a sharp, defensive intelligence before they landed on him. She was slighter than he had imagined, a delicate thing who looked as if a strong wind might carry her off. He saw the flicker of appraisal in her gaze, the quick assessment of him, the town, the harsh sunlight. She held a small, worn valise in one hand and clutched a reticule in the other as if it were a shield. "Mr. McCrae?" Her voice was soft, but clear and steady. He gave a curt nod. "Ma'am." He took her valise. Surprised by its lightness, it felt as though she carried nothing at all. As they stood there, a silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken terms of their contract. He could feel the eyes of the town on them. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, pursed her lips into a knot of disapproval. Two cowboys lounging on the porch of the saloon nudged each other, their leering grins making Elias's skin crawl. "She's a pretty one. McCrae," one of them called out, his voice thick with insinuation. "Where'd you find her?" Clara flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, but her chin lifted a fraction higher. Before Elias could speak, she did, her voice cutting through the dry air, colder than a winter morning. "He found me in the newspaper," she said, her gaze sweeping over the cowboys with disdain. "In the section for respectable ladies, which I'm quite certain you gentlemen do not read." The men blinked, momentarily stunned into silence by her sharp tongue. Elias felt a grudging flicker of something that might have been respect. He had hired a performer, and it seemed she knew her lines. He gestured toward his wagon. "Let's go." The ride to the ranch was silent. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, the plains stretching out in an endless expanse of brown and gray under a pale blue sky. Clara sat ramrod straight on the wagon seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not comment on the dry fields or the distant, hazy mountains. She seemed to be conserving her words, holding herself in reserve. When they arrived at the ranch, Elias saw it through her eyes for the first time in years. He saw the peeling paint, the overgrown weeds choking the path, the profound and aching loneliness of the place. A wave of shame washed over him. He carried her bag to the front door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale. A fine layer of dust coated every surface. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. She stepped inside, her gaze taking in the Spartan furnishings, the cold hearth, the faint scent of sorrow that clung to the curtains. Her expression remained unreadable. "We should be clear on the rules," Elias stated, feeling the need to re-establish the transactional nature of their relationship. He was not her husband. This was not her home. "You'll have the spare room. It's small, but it's clean. My room is at the end of the hall. That door stays closed." She met his gaze without flinching. "I understand." "In town, and if anyone should call, you are my wife. You will act the part. You are to be gentle, proper. You will smile." He said the word as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. "On Sundays, we go to church. You will sit with me. You will nod at the preacher's wife. You will not offer opinions on the sermon." "And what do you offer, Mr. McCrae?" she asked, a faint edge to her voice. "I offer my name. A roof over your head. I keep you safe. No one in this town will bother you, because you're my responsibility now. That's the deal." Her lips curved into a semblance of a smile, but it was a bitter, tired thing that did not reach her eyes. "It seems a fair trade, a name for a smile." "One more thing," he added, his voice dropping. "My wife, my late wife, Sarah. The people in town will talk about her. They will compare you to her. You will say nothing. You will let them talk." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not sympathy, but a kind of weary understanding, as if the ghosts of the past were familiar territory to her. "I am adept at saying nothing, Mr. McCrae." The days that followed fell into a quiet, rigid routine. Elias rose before dawn and worked the ranch. Clara kept to the house. She was a silent, efficient presence. She cleaned the layers of dust, aired out the musty rooms, and cooked simple, tasteless meals that they ate in suffocating silence at opposite ends of the long kitchen table. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed both practiced and innate, a ghost in Sarah's house. In town, she played her part perfectly. When they rode in for supplies, she sat beside him in the wagon. A picture of demure wifehood, she offered a small, polite smile to those they passed. She endured the prying eyes of the women and the lingering gazes of the men with a placid expression that revealed nothing. Elias found himself watching her, noting the subtle shift in her posture, the way she could conjure a soft, distant warmth into her eyes when someone spoke to her directly. She was a better actor than he had anticipated. He did his part, too. When Martha Gable cornered Clara outside the mercantile, her questions dripping with sanctimonious venom, Elias stepped in. "Clara is still adjusting." "Martha," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "she's tired from her journey." He placed a hand on the small of Clara's back, a gesture that felt foreign and calculated. He felt her stiffen for a fraction of a second before relaxing into the role. It was a possessive gesture, not a tender one. He was not protecting her. He was protecting his arrangement. "She is my responsibility now," he thought, the words a constant, grating reminder of his predicament. The land remained dry. The well was running low, and the creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle. The ranch was failing, and the pretense of his new marriage felt like a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. Some days, the effort of it all was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he could hardly breathe. Clara seemed to find her own refuge from the oppressive quiet of the house. He would see her standing on the porch in the late afternoon, her face turned toward the vast, empty expanse of the plains, her eyes tracking the shadow of a hawk circling in the immense sky. She seemed to draw strength from the wildness, from the lonely cry of the wind that whipped loose strands of hair across her face. One evening, he returned from mending a fence line later than usual, bone-weary and coated in sweat and dust. As he approached the barn to tend to his horse, he heard it, a sound so unexpected, so out of place in his world of silence and sorrow, that he froze. Music. It was faint, hesitant, but unmistakable. The melody was somber, a melancholic tune that seemed to weep and wander through the twilight air. He followed the sound into the barn. There, in the dusty gloom of a back corner, was Sarah's piano. He had dragged it out here after she died, unable to bear the sight of it in the house, yet unwilling to get rid of it. It was covered by a canvas sheet, thick with the dust of 2 years. Clara sat on an old crate, the sheet pulled back. Her slender fingers moved over the yellowed keys, pressing them with a tentative, rusty grace. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the sad, beautiful music. He saw then the ghost of another life in her posture, the echo of a woman who had once known concert halls and applause, a woman who performed for men in fine suits, not for the rats in a dusty barn. He remembered the vague, cutting remarks he'd heard whispered in town, speculation that her fine manners were learned in a place less than respectable. He had heard the word courtesan muttered once, and the memory made his gut twist with a strange, unwelcome anger. She did not hear him. She was lost in the music, her hands moving with more confidence now, the notes filling the cavernous space of the barn with a profound and heartbreaking beauty. Elias stood in the shadows, listening, a forgotten ache stirring in his chest. The music was like her, fragile yet resilient, full of a sorrow that was too deep for words. He backed away as silently as he had come, leaving her to her secrets. That night, the dream came for him again. It was always the same. The close, stifling air of the bedroom, the scent of blood and fear. Sarah's face, pale and slick with sweat, her eyes wide with a terror that ripped him apart. The baby, silent and still. The midwife's panicked whispers, the useless platitudes, the final, shuddering sigh that left him utterly alone in a world that had lost its center. He cried out, a strangled, guttural sound torn from the depths of his sleep. "Sarah!" The sound of his own voice shocked him into a half-waking state, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom smell of iron and loss filling his nostrils. He lay there, trembling in the dark, caught between the nightmare and the hollow reality of his empty bed. In her small room down the hall, Clara Hale lay awake, staring at the moonlight painting a pale square on her floor. She had heard the cry. It was not the shout of a man startled from sleep, but the raw, broken sound of a soul being ripped open. She had heard the name, whispered with an agony that made the air in her own room feel thin and cold. She lay perfectly still, her hands clutching the thin blanket. A part of her, a foolish, tender part, she thought had died long ago, wanted to go to him, to offer a glass of water, a quiet word, some small human comfort against the vastness of the night. But she crushed the impulse before it could take root. She was an employee. Her duties were clearly defined: cleaning, cooking, smiling for the neighbors. Comforting a grieving man in the dark was not in the contract. Pity was a dangerous currency, one she could not afford to spend. She had her own ghosts to contend with, her own nightmares that waited for her in the quiet hours. His pain was his own. It had nothing to do with her. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, and closed her eyes, the sound of his broken whisper still echoing in the silence of the house. "He hired me to smile," she told herself, the words a cold, hard shield around her heart, not to feel sorry for him. The silence of the house was a living thing, a presence that pressed in on Clara from all sides. In the first few weeks, she felt she might suffocate from it. It was a different kind of silence than she had known in the city, not the mere absence of noise, but a vast, empty vessel that held the echoes of a life that was not hers. To fight it, she turned to work. Work had always been a refuge, a way to occupy her hands when her mind threatened to betray her. She began with the kitchen. She scrubbed the soot from the stove until the iron gleamed. She scoured the pots and pans, polished the few pieces of silverware, and washed the window over the sink until the harsh Wyoming sunlight streamed in. illuminating the dancing dust motes. She found a stash of Sarah's old recipes, tucked away in a tin box. The handwriting was neat and round, the script of a happy, hopeful woman. A bitter pang of something, jealousy, perhaps, or a profound sense of trespass, shot through her. She put the recipes away and began to bake from memory. The first loaf of bread was a disaster, a hard, dense brick that Elias politely ignored at dinner. But she persisted. The kneading was a punishment and a prayer, a physical exertion that quieted the frantic buzzing in her head. Soon, the scent of baking bread began to fill the quiet rooms, a small, domestic miracle that pushed back against the stale air of grief. She mended Elias's work shirts, her needle moving with a swift, practiced rhythm, a skill learned in a different life to maintain the delicate lace on a performance gown. She sewed new curtains for the kitchen window from a bolt of cheap calico she bought in town. The small, cheerful pattern a defiant splash of color in the monochrome world of the ranch. She was not doing it for him. She told herself this every day. She was doing it for herself, to impose a small pocket of order on the chaos of her life. It was a way to build a wall of routine between herself and the gaping loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. Her other secret was the barn. Each afternoon, when Elias was out on the range, she would slip away to the dusty cathedral of hay and shadows. The old piano was her confessional. At first, her fingers were clumsy strangers on the keys, stiff and trembling with a mixture of disuse and remembered trauma. The last time she had played for an audience, their faces had been a blur of scorn and disgust. The memory was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But the music was still inside her. It flowed from a wellspring deeper than shame. The first hesitant notes gave way to stumbling scales, then to broken chords, slowly, painstakingly. The muscle memory returned. Her hands grew steadier, more confident. She never played the flamboyant, crowd-pleasing pieces from her past. Instead, she played the somber, searching melodies of her present. The music was a language for her sorrow, a way to speak of the betrayal and humiliation without giving it the dignity of words. The barn became her sanctuary, the one place where she was not Mrs. McCrae, the mail-order bride, but simply Clara, a woman alone with her ghosts and her music. Elias noticed the changes, though he never spoke of them. He noticed the scent of bread, the clean floors, the mended tear in his favorite shirt. He also noticed the change in town. The tide of gossip had begun to recede. His marriage, a fiction born of desperation, was solidifying into an accepted fact. The whispers had not stopped entirely, but they had changed their tune. He was no longer the tragic widower wasting away, but a man who had pulled himself back from the brink. His new wife was quiet, respectable, and a diligent homemaker. The town council had not sent the sheriff out again. The performance, it seemed, was working. The illusion was shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. They were in the Mercantile, a place Clara dreaded. It was the hub of the town's social life, a place where women gathered to trade gossip over bolts of fabric and sacks of flour. As Clara was examining a spool of thread, the store's proprietor, Jedediah Finch, approached her. He was a portly man with small, avaricious eyes and a damp smile that never reached them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. McCrae," he said, his voice oozing a false cordiality. "Finding everything you need?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Finch," Clara replied, not looking up from the thread. "It is a pleasure to see you brightening up our little town," he continued, moving closer, his bulk crowding her against the counter. "A woman of your refinement. It is not often we see such elegance out here. You must miss the city, the theaters, the grand parties." His words were laced with insinuation, each one a carefully placed barb. Clara's back went rigid. She knew this type of man. She had met him 100 times in the drawing rooms of her past. Men who saw a woman's beauty not as a gift, but as a commodity. "I am quite content here," she said, her voice clipped. Finch chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. Of course, but a talent like yours. I've heard you were a performer, a pianist of some renown. It must be a waste, playing only for a husband. Such hands were surely made to entertain a wider audience. The implication was as clear as it was vile. He was not talking about a concert hall. He was picturing her in a saloon, or worse. Elias, who had been speaking to another rancher by the door, turned at the sound of Finch's tone. He saw the way Finch was leaning over Clara, the sick smile on his face, the pale, frozen set of Clara's jaw. Elias moved before he had time to think. Years of suppressed grief and simmering rage coalesced into a single, white-hot point. He crossed the store in 3 long strides, grabbed Finch by the collar of his shirt, and slammed him back against a barrel of pickles. The barrel rocked, and a cascade of brine and cucumbers sloshed onto the floor. "You will not speak to my wife," Elias growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Finch's eyes widened in shock and fear. "McCrae, I was only making conversation." "I heard your conversation," Elias snarled. He drew back his fist, a calloused, work-hardened knot of bone and sinew, and drove it into Finch's soft jaw. The sound was a sickening crack, followed by Finch's grunt of pain as he slid down the barrel to sit in the pickle brine. A dazed expression on his face. The store fell into a dead silence. Every customer, every clerk, stared, mouths agape. Elias stood over Finch, his chest heaving, his knuckles scraped and bleeding. He looked at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else, a flicker of shock in his own eyes. He had not struck another man in anger since he was a boy. He turned and looked at Clara. Her face was as white as bone china, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and astonishment. Without a word, he grabbed the sack of flour he had come for, threw a few coins on the counter, and took her by the elbow. He steered her out of the store and into the blinding sunlight, away from the shocked and silent stares. The ride back to the ranch was the longest silence yet. The air in the wagon crackled with unspoken thoughts. Clara sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the rumps of the horses. Elias's knuckles were bleeding freely onto the reins, but he seemed not to notice. When they were nearly home, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Elias did not look at her. His eyes were hard, his jaw set like granite. He stared out at the dusty plains, at the fences that marked the boundaries of his world. "Because this land is mine," he said, his voice rough, "and so are the people on it." The words hung between them, stark and unsettling. It was not a declaration of affection. It was a statement of ownership. She was his responsibility, his property, another asset to be defended like his fences and his water rights. It was insulting, and yet no one had ever defended her before, not even as property. She felt a strange, unwelcome warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she immediately and violently suppressed. A few days later, Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch. Elias met him on the porch, his stance defensive. Clara watched from behind the kitchen curtain, her heart thudding. "Jed Finch is pressing charges." "Elias," Brody said, looking weary. "Assault. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're a brute and your new wife is a harlot from a Cheyenne saloon." "Finch is a liar," Elias said, his voice flat. "Maybe so," Brody conceded. "But you can't go around punching merchants in broad daylight. The council is in an uproar. This is exactly the kind of instability they were worried about. Some are saying this woman is a bad influence." Elias's hands clenched at his sides. "She's a decent woman," he said, the words low and fierce, each one a stone thrown in defiance. "Finch insulted her. He insulted my wife. I did what any man would do." Behind the curtain, Clara's breath caught in her throat. A decent woman. The words were a balm on a wound she had forgotten she had. The world had called her many things in the past year: fallen, ruined, shameless, Wanton, but no one, not once, had called her decent. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She felt tears prick the backs of her eyes, hot and sharp. She turned away from the window, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that escaped her, a short, bitter laugh that was half a sob. It was absurd. It was all a lie. And yet, she had never heard anything so beautiful. The incident created a subtle shift in their careful, silent orbit, an awareness of each other that had not been there before. It came to a head the following week. Clara was helping Elias unload some feed sacks from the wagon when her foot slipped on the worn wagon step. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, as she twisted her ankle and tumbled to the ground. Elias was at her side in an instant, his face etched with a concern that looked startlingly genuine. "Are you hurt?" "It's my ankle," she gasped, cradling it. A sharp, searing pain was shooting up her leg. He gently probed the swelling joint with surprising tenderness. "It's sprained. Badly." Without another word, he scooped her into his arms. She was so light, she felt like a child. Her own arms went instinctively around his neck, her face pressed against the rough cotton of his shirt. He smelled of dust, sweat, and clean wind. It was an honest, earthy smell, and for a dizzying moment, she felt a profound sense of safety. He carried her into the house and set her down gently on the sofa, his movements careful and deliberate. He fetched a bucket of cold water from the well and a roll of clean bandages. He knelt before her, and with an awkward reverence, he took her foot in his large, calloused hands. As he began to wrap the ankle, his rough fingers brushed against her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled up her entire body. She looked down at his bent head, at the dark hair falling over his forehead, at the intense concentration on his face. He was so close. The air between them felt thick, charged with a strange, new energy. When he was finished, he looked up, and his eyes met hers. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. He saw the flicker of pain and something else, something softer and more vulnerable. In her stormy eyes, she saw the raw concern and a deep, buried loneliness in his. His hand still rested on her shin, his thumb stroking her skin in a small, unconscious gesture. Her own hand, of its own volition, lifted and rested on his, her fingers curling slightly around his. His skin was warm and rough. His hand was so much larger than hers, a hand capable of both violence and a surprising gentleness. The touch lingered, a silent question hanging in the air between them. Then, as if suddenly remembering themselves, they both pulled back at once. The spell was broken. Elias stood up abruptly, clearing his throat. "You should stay off it," he said, his voice gruff again, the wall of his detachment firmly back in place. "I'll bring you some supper." He turned and left the room, leaving Clara with a tingling in her skin and a frantic, unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. In the days that followed, Elias began to work around the barn. He did not mention the piano, but one morning, Clara saw that he had patched the section of the roof directly above it, where a leak had been threatening the old wood. A few days later, a sturdy, well-made piano bench appeared where the rickety crate had been. They were unspoken gestures, acts of a man who did not know how to speak the language of gratitude or kindness, but could build it with his own two hands. Clara, confined to the house with her sprained ankle, found herself with too much time to think. The silence, once a mere presence, now began to whisper to her. It spoke of her past, of the glittering, hollow life she had lost. She found an old pen and a stack of paper and began to write. She wrote letters she would never send, pouring out all the words she kept locked away inside her. She wrote to her younger sister, filling the pages with bright, cheerful lies about her handsome husband and her beautiful new home, painting a picture of a happiness she could barely imagine. She wrote to the man who had ruined her, a man of wealth and power named Julian Croft, The words she wrote to him were acid and venom, a torrent of rage and heartbreak that she had never been allowed to voice. She detailed his false promises, his casual cruelty, the way he had smiled as he cast her aside and orchestrated her public disgrace. And finally, she wrote to the girl she used to be, the naive, trusting girl who believed in love and sonatas, who thought that talent and a pure heart were enough to protect her from the world. The letter was a eulogy, a farewell to an innocence she would never know again. She folded the letters, her secrets and sorrows pressed into the creases of the cheap paper, and hid them away in the bottom of her valise. The ankle healed, but a different kind of ache had settled deep within her. The small moments of connection with Elias, the punch, the overheard compliment, the lingering touch, had unsettled her. They had cracked the careful facade she had built around herself. Hope was a dangerous thing, a weed that could choke you if you let it take root. She could not afford it. She was here for a purpose, a transaction. Her heart was not part of the deal. One evening, watching the sunset, painting the vast sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, she clutched the fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. She was not the blushing bride from her letters to her sister. She was not the vengeful fury from her letters to Julian. She was a survivor, and nothing more. "I'm not here to heal," she told herself, the words a familiar, cold comfort. "I'm just here to survive." The autumn air grew heavy and thick, carrying a strange, metallic scent on the wind. The sky, which for weeks had been a vast, unforgiving expanse of pale blue, began to curdle at the edges, turning a bruised purple gray. An unnatural stillness fell over the ranch, a held breath before a scream. Elias. His eyes narrowed at the horizon, worked with a grim urgency, securing the livestock and tying down anything that the wind might claim. Clara, watching from the kitchen window, felt a primal fear prickle her skin. This was no ordinary prairie squall. This was a monster gathering its strength. The storm broke just after dusk. It did not arrive with a gentle patter of rain, but with a sudden, violent roar, as if the sky itself had been torn in two. The wind shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the small house, rattling the windows in their frames until Clara was certain they would shatter. Then came the hail, stones of ice the size of acorns, hammering against the roof with the deafening sound of buckshot. The house, which had always felt so lonely and empty, now seemed terrifyingly fragile, a tiny wooden shell against the wrath of God. A sound like a cannonball striking the roof echoed through the rooms, followed by the splintering of wood. An icy draft snaked into the kitchen. Elias burst through the door, his face grim. "The roof over your room is gone," he shouted over the din. "The ceiling is collapsing. Grab a lamp." There was no time for fear, only action. She followed him into the main room, the heart of the house, where a massive stone fireplace stood. It was the most fortified part of the structure. Water was already dripping from the ceiling in a dozen places, and the wind howled through new cracks in the walls. "We stay here," he commanded, stuffing rags into the gaps under the door. "It's the safest place." They huddled before the hearth. The fire Elias built a sputtering, defiant beacon against the raging dark. The storm was a physical assault, a relentless battery that seemed intent on erasing them from the face of the earth. For hours, they sat in silence, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. The sound of a large section of the barn roof tearing away was a great, groaning scream of metal and wood. Clara thought of the piano, exposed to the elements, and a sharp, irrational pang of grief shot through her. It felt like another part of her was being destroyed. Sometime after midnight, the hail stopped, replaced by a driving, horizontal rain. The wind, however, did not relent. A section of the ceiling in the main room gave way, and a torrent of cold water cascaded onto the floor, narrowly missing them. They were forced to press closer to the fire, into a small, dry pocket of the room. Elias took the thick wool blanket from his bed and draped it over both their shoulders. The shared space was no longer a matter of choice, but of survival. Under the blanket, the air was close and warm. Clara could feel the heat radiating from Elias's body, solid and real beside her. She could smell the rain and the damp earth on his clothes. In the flickering firelight, his face was a mask of grim endurance, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the flames. But as the hours wore on, she saw the mask begin to crack. The wind moaned through the damaged roof, a low, mournful sound, like a woman weeping. Elias flinched, his whole body going rigid. He closed his eyes, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. "That sound," he whispered, his voice so low she almost did not hear him. "It sounds just like her." Clara said nothing. She knew he was not speaking to her, but to the ghosts that the storm had stirred up. He began to tremble, a deep, shuddering tremor that shook his entire frame. The stoic rancher, the man of granite and silence, was breaking apart before her eyes. "I should have gotten the doctor from Cheyenne," he choked out, the words torn from him. "The midwife, she didn't know what to do. The baby, it was turned wrong." He turned his face to her, and in the firelight, she saw that his eyes were swimming with tears. The sight was so shocking, so profoundly intimate, that she felt she should look away, but she could not. She was transfixed by the raw, unshielded agony in his gaze. "She screamed for so long," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And I just held her hand. Useless, I just stood there. Useless, while she bled out on the sheets. My Sarah." A single tear tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He had carried this guilt, this horror, alone in the silence for 2 years. Now, in the heart of the storm, it had finally broken free. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, and a terrible, dry sob racked his body. Clara's heart twisted in her chest. All the coldness, all the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself, crumbled to dust. This was not the man who had hired her, not the stoic owner of the land. This was a human being drowning in a sea of pain. Without thinking, she shifted closer and pulled the blanket tighter around his shaking shoulders. She did not pat his back or offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat with him in the darkness, a silent witness to his grief, sharing her small pocket of warmth. She listened as he confessed his deepest fear, that in the final moments. Sarah had looked at him not with love, but with terror and accusation, as if he were the author of her fate. The storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, a different kind of tempest was finally passing. He cried until there were no tears left, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. The silence that fell between them now was not hollow or awkward. It was full, heavy with the weight of his confession. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Perhaps for the first time, he saw not the fragile actress, not the convenient bride, but the woman who had sat with him through the darkest night of his soul and had not flinched. The firelight softened the sharp angles of her face, turning her stormy eyes to the color of warm slate. He leaned in, his movement slow, tentative. She saw it coming, felt the shift in the air, the sudden, sharp intake of her own breath. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm and tasting of sorrow. It was a moment suspended in time, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of loneliness. He was going to kiss her, and a wild, terrifying part of her wanted him to. But the fear was stronger, the fear of what this meant, of what it would cost her. This was not in the contract. This vulnerability, this raw, messy emotion, was a language she no longer trusted. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, she pulled back, turning her face away. "You didn't hire me for this," she whispered, the words like stones in her throat. The spell shattered. The fragile bridge collapsed into the abyss. Elias recoiled as if she had struck him. The raw vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced by a shuttered, wounded look. He pulled his side of the blanket away and stood up, turning his back to her to stare into the dying fire. The wall of ice was back, higher and colder than ever. He had opened the door to the most painful room in his heart, and she had closed it in his face. In the days that followed, Elias was a ghost. He was colder, more distant than he had been even in the beginning. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and devoid of all emotion. He worked with a feverish, punishing intensity, clearing the debris from the storm, patching the roof. His silence a constant, deafening reproach. The shared intimacy of that night might as well have been a dream. Clara felt the rejection like a physical blow. She had done what she had to do to protect herself, but it had left her feeling more alone than ever. A week after the storm, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the house any longer, she told him she was riding into town for supplies. He merely grunted in response, not looking up from the harness he was mending. She hitched the wagon herself and made the lonely journey under a sky that was once again a hard, indifferent blue. She finished her errands quickly, eager to leave the prying eyes of the town. As she was loading the last of the sacks into the wagon, she realized she had forgotten to buy salt. With a sigh, she turned back toward the mercantile, deciding to take the alleyway as a shortcut. It was a mistake. 2 men were loitering in the shadows of the alley, cowboys she recognized as cronies of Jedediah Finch. They were drunk, their faces flushed, their eyes holding a predatory gleam. They blocked her path. "Well, look what we have here," one of them slurred, a foul grin spreading across his face. "It's McCrae's pretty little city bird." Clara's blood ran cold. She tried to step around them, but the other one moved to block her. "What's your hurry, ma'am? A respectable lady like you shouldn't be walking in alleys, unless you're looking for a different kind of company." "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight with a fear she refused to show. "Oh, we'll excuse you," the first one said, reaching out to grab her arm. "Jed says you're used to entertaining men for a price. We ain't got much money, but we're willing to be generous." The familiar, sickening dread washed over her. This moment, this violation, was a scene she had lived through in her nightmares 1,000 times. But she was not the same girl who had been broken in the city. She was a survivor. As his fingers closed around her arm, her hand darted into the small sewing kit in her reticule and closed around the one thing she carried for protection, a short, wicked-looking blade she used for cutting thick thread. She drove the point of the blade into the back of his hand. He howled in pain and surprise, snatching his hand back. In that instant of hesitation, she shoved past him and ran, but the other man was faster. He caught her by the hair, yanking her back with such force that she stumbled and fell, her head striking the hard-packed earth. Her vision swam. He was on top of her in an instant, his weight crushing her, his sour, whiskey-laced breath hot on her face as he fumbled with the buttons of her dress. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. A voice, low and colder than a grave, cut through the alley. "Get off her!" It was Elias. The man on top of her looked up, his drunken bravado evaporating into pure fear. Elias stood at the mouth of the alley, his face a thunderous mask of pure fury. He did not look like a rancher. He looked like a wolf. He moved with a terrifying speed, hauling the man off her and throwing him against the brick wall like a sack of grain. The other cowboy, clutching his bleeding hand, made a move to run, but Elias was on him in a second, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a blur of motion. Elias turned back to the first man, who was scrambling to his feet. There was no fight, only a brutal, methodical punishment. Elias's fists rose and fell, the sound of his knuckles hitting flesh and bone echoing in the narrow alley. When it was over, both men were crumpled on the ground, groaning and bloody. Elias stood over them, his chest heaving, his hands dripping blood. Then he turned to her. He saw her on the ground, her dress torn, a trickle of blood running from a cut on her temple, her body trembling uncontrollably. The fury in his eyes dissolved into a look of such profound horror and helplessness that it stole her breath. He knelt beside her, his large hands shaking as he reached for her, his touch incredibly gentle. "Clara," he whispered, her name a prayer and a curse. He carefully brushed the hair from her face, his thumb wiping away the blood. Without another word, he gathered her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out of the alley. He carried her all the way to the wagon and laid her gently on the seat. He did not speak on the ride home. His hands, gripping the reins, were white-knuckled, and a muscle in his jaw worked relentlessly. When they reached the ranch, he carried her inside, into the main room, and set her down on the sofa. He cleaned and bandaged the cut on her head with a surgeon's focus, his movements deft and silent. "I will kill them," he said finally, his voice a raw, jagged thing. "I will ride back into town and I will finish it." "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please, do not—" He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "They cannot do this. They cannot touch you." A single tear slid down her cheek, hot and bitter. "It does not matter," she said, her voice hollow. "I am already used to men seeing me as a thing. It's what they do. Revenge will not change that. It will only make it worse for us." Her words seemed to drain the fight out of him. He looked down at her, at the bruises beginning to form on her skin, at the torn fabric of her dress, and his fury crumbled into a devastating sadness. He sank to his knees before her and, for the second time in his life, she saw him cry. But this time, it was not for his dead wife. It was for her. That night, she could not bear the thought of being alone in her cold, dark room. The shadows held too many terrors. After he had banked the fire, she stood in the doorway of his room, a trembling silhouette. He looked up from his bed, his expression unreadable. "I am afraid," she whispered. He understood. He pulled back the covers on the other side of the bed, a silent invitation. She lay down, her body rigid, as far from him as she could get. The bed was wide, a vast, empty space between them. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. After a long moment, he rolled onto his side, facing her. He reached across the divide and gently took her hand. Then, with an infinite patience, he pulled her across the expanse of the mattress until her back was nestled against his chest. He draped an arm over her, a solid, protective weight. He did not touch her skin. His hand rested on the blanket covering her shoulder. It was a gesture of pure comfort, of safety, devoid of all passion. He was a shield, not a lover. She lay there, wrapped in his warmth, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her back. The trembling began to subside. In the safety of his arms, the horrors of the day began to recede, replaced by a profound and aching confusion. She whispered into the darkness, the words aimed as much at herself as at him, a desperate attempt to hold on to the familiar, cold logic of their arrangement. "You hired me to smile, not to moan." Her voice was steady, but only just. At the very end, it caught, trembling on the last word, betraying the lie. It was a tremor of fear, of pain, and of a fragile, terrifying hope that he would hear the truth hidden behind the words. Something shifted in the house after that night. The silence, once a weapon of mutual defense, softened at the edges. It was no longer a hollow, echoing thing, but a quiet space they began to tentatively share. The attack in the alley had broken through the last of their pretenses, leaving them with a raw and undeniable truth. They were two damaged souls, adrift in a hostile world, and all they had was each other. Elias began to care for her with a quiet, solemn devotion. The change was not in words. He was still a man of profound silence, but in 1,000 small, unspoken gestures. He would rise before her, and when she emerged from her room, a plate of eggs and bacon would be waiting on the kitchen table. He insisted on rebandaging her head himself each morning. His hands, which could wrestle a steer to the ground, now impossibly tender as they moved around her wound. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the bruised twilight settle over the plains, he came out with a brush. He did not ask for permission. He simply stood behind her chair and began to brush her long, honey-colored hair. The first stroke was hesitant, almost clumsy, but he quickly found a slow, steady rhythm. Clara froze, her body going rigid with surprise. No one had brushed her hair since her mother, long ago. Julian Croft had liked to run his fingers through it, a gesture of possession, not of care. She forced herself to relax, to lean into the strange, disarming intimacy of the act. The rhythmic pull of the brush through the long strands was soothing, a silent apology for the world's brutality, a promise of safety. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt not like a performer or a pawn, but simply a woman being cared for. He said nothing, and she said nothing, and in that shared silence, more passed between them than words ever could. The piano bench he had built before the storm had been destroyed, smashed to kindling by the collapsed section of the barn roof. One afternoon, she saw him out by the woodpile, not chopping firewood, but carefully measuring and sawing planks of smooth, fine-grained pine. Over the next few days, in the spare moments between his ranch work, he crafted a new one. It was simple, sturdy, and perfect. He placed it in the barn, in front of the piano which, by some miracle, had sustained only minor damage, and left it there without a word. It was his way of giving her back her sanctuary. A few nights later, they were sitting on the porch again, the air cool and crisp with the promise of true autumn. The shared silence was comfortable now, a soft blanket instead of a wall of ice. It was Clara who finally broke it, her voice soft in the gathering dark. "Tell me about her," she said. "About Sarah." Elias stiffened, his gaze fixed on the distant line where the earth met the sky. He had confessed his grief to her in the storm, but he had never spoken of the woman herself. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because I sleep in her house," Clara said simply. "I eat at her table. I think I should know her name as more than a ghost." He was silent for a long time, and she thought he would refuse. But then he began to speak, his voice low and halting at first, then flowing more freely as the memories took hold. He told her how they had met at a church social, how he had been struck dumb by her laughter. He spoke of her kindness, her love for the harsh and unforgiving land he had brought her to. He described the way she would hum as she baked, the garden she had managed to coax from the dry soil, the dreams they had built together in the small, lonely house. And then he told her about the night she died. He did not hold back this time. He recounted every detail, every agonizing second, with a raw, brutal honesty. He spoke of the midwife's rising panic, of his own desperate, useless prayers, of the terrible, final stillness that had descended on the room. He did not just confess his guilt, he dissected it, laying it bare for her to see. And as he spoke, he began to cry again, not with the violent, shuddering sobs of the storm, but with a deep, quiet grief, the tears tracking slow, familiar paths down his weathered cheeks. Clara did not move. She just listened, her presence a steady anchor in his storm of memory. When he was finished, the night was full of the sound of crickets and his own ragged breathing. "Now you," he said, his voice thick, "tell me what happened to you." And so she did. She told him the story in a flat, dead voice, as if recounting a tale that had happened to someone else, a girl she had once read about in a book. She spoke of her life in the city, of her modest success as a pianist, of the thrill of performing. She spoke of Julian Croft, of his charm and his wealth, of the beautiful, impossible promises he had whispered to her in the dark. She told him how she had believed him, how she had given him not just her body, but her trust, her reputation, her future. She recounted the night he had brought his powerful friends to a private recital, how they had watched her with the eyes of men appraising livestock, She told him of the argument that followed, of her refusal to be his private entertainment, and she told him of the ruin, how he had cast her aside, and to protect his own name, had started the vicious rumors himself. He painted her as a woman of loose morals, a courtesan who had tried to trap him, a story his wealthy friends were all too eager to corroborate. Her contracts were cancelled. Doors were slammed in her face. The society that had once applauded her now turned its back, shunning her with a quiet, brutal efficiency. She had lost everything: her career, her home, her name. The advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper had been her last, desperate option. When her story was finished, the porch was shrouded in a profound and heavy silence. He had lost his future in a single night of blood and tragedy. She had lost hers in a slow, public execution by rumor and innuendo. They were both survivors of a different kind of death. Elias reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His grasp was firm, his calloused palm enveloping her slender fingers. "He will not get to write the end of your story," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. From that night on, a new, unspoken accord existed between them. They began to eat their dinners by candlelight. It was not a romantic gesture. Not yet, it was a practical one. The flickering light softened the harsh lines of the room, creating a small, intimate island of warmth in the vast, lonely house. It made the silence feel less empty, the food taste less of survival and more of sustenance. They would talk, sometimes, of small, simple things: the weather, the price of feed, a hawk Elias had seen that day. They were the hesitant first steps of two people learning to walk together after having been crippled. The news arrived with Sheriff Brody. A week later, he rode out to the ranch looking grim and uncomfortable. "It's about Jedediah Finch," he said, avoiding Clara's eyes. "And those two drifters he ran with, they found them this morning, downriver. All three of them. Looks like they got drunk, fell in, and drowned." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She looked at Elias. His face was a stone mask, utterly unreadable. "A shame," Elias said, his voice flat. "The thing is," Brody continued, shifting his weight, "Finch had a broken jaw, and the other two, they were bruised up pretty bad, like they'd been in a nasty fight before they went into the water." He finally looked at Elias, his gaze sharp and questioning. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, McCrae?" "I know they were a disgrace to this town," Elias said, his voice even. "Good riddance." Brody held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed and shook his head. "There's no proof of anything else. The council will be happy to close the book on them. Just be careful. Elias." After the sheriff left, Clara turned to Elias. The question was burning in her, a terrifying, urgent thing. "Did you?" Elias met her gaze, his eyes dark and deep as a well. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the barn. Later that evening, from the kitchen window, she saw him by the water pump, scrubbing his hands with a fierce intensity. He paused and looked down at his knuckles, which were scraped and raw, and with a piece of clean cloth, he carefully wiped away a small, dark speck of what looked like dried blood. A shiver of fear and something else, something dark and thrilling, went through her. He had taken justice into his own hands. For her, the thought was both terrifying and seductive. She was living in the house of a man who might be a killer, and yet she had never felt safer in her life. The town, however, was not so easily placated. The official story was drowning, but the unofficial one, the one whispered over fences and in the pews at church, was murder. And the motive, everyone agreed, was the honor of his mysterious city wife. The tide of gossip turned on them again, this time with a more venomous current. She was no longer just a quiet stranger. She was a Jezebel, a woman of shadowed history who had brought violence to their peaceful community. The church elders, led by the sour-faced Reverend Miller, decided to act. They arrived at the ranch one afternoon, a grim delegation of piety and judgment. Mr. McCrae, the Reverend began, his voice dripping with condescension. The community is concerned. There are rumors about your wife's past, vicious rumors, to be sure, but they are persistent. In light of the recent violence, the church council feels that, for the good of the town and for the salvation of her own soul, Mrs. McCrae must make a public confession of her past sins before the congregation. Elias, who had been standing silently beside Clara on the porch, took a step forward. His face was calm, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. My wife has no sins to confess to you, Reverend. Every soul has sins, another elder chimed in, and secrecy is the devil's favorite soil. If she is a decent woman, she has nothing to fear from the truth. If she refuses, we will have no choice but to expel you both from the community. You will be shunned. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was happening again. The judgment, the whispers, the public shaming. She wanted to run, to disappear, to simply cease to exist. But Elias did not back down. Then we will be shunned, he said, his voice ringing with finality. Now get off my land. After the elders had departed, their face tight with righteous indignation, the weight of their threat settled over the ranch. To be shunned in a town like Redemption was a death sentence. No one would sell them supplies, buy their cattle, or offer help if it was needed. They would be utterly alone. That evening, Elias came to her as she stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. We can leave, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I can sell the ranch. It is not worth much right now, but it would be enough to start over somewhere else. Oregon, maybe, or California. Somewhere they do not know us. Clara turned to look at him, stunned. He was willing to sell this land, the place where Sarah was buried, the only thing he had left of his past. He was willing to give it all up. For her. The magnitude of the sacrifice was a physical weight in her chest. She looked around the simple room, at the life she had begun to build from the ashes of her old one. She thought of the piano in the barn, of the quiet comfort of their shared silence, of the fierce, protective loyalty in his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, she did not want to run. No, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. This is your home. You've run enough, from your grief, from your memories, and I have run enough from my past. We will not run anymore. His eyes searched hers, full of a raw, questioning hope. Later that night, the wind picked up, howling through the half-repaired sections of the house, rattling the windows. It was the sound of the world trying to tear them apart. They lay in his bed, on their separate sides, the space between them a gulf of unspoken tension. The house moaned around them, a lonely, desolate sound. Clara could not bear it anymore. The fear, the hope, the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being truly seen by another person. It was too much to hold inside. She rolled onto her side to face him. In the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window, she could just make out the shape of his face, the strong line of his jaw. She reached across the chasm between them, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it flat against his chest. She could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. He did not move, did not breathe. He was waiting. You didn't ask for this, she whispered into the roaring silence, her voice a fragile, trembling thread against the howl of the wind. She moved closer, until her lips were almost touching his ear. But I'm offering it anyway. His heart hammered against her palm, a frantic, powerful rhythm that seemed to echo the howling of the wind outside. For a long moment, Elias did not move, did not breathe. Her whispered words hung in the air, a fragile offering in the face of the storm, both inside and out. Then, with a low sound that was half groan, half prayer, he moved. He rolled toward her, his body a solid, warm weight in the cold room. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her ache. In the dim moonlight, his eyes were dark pools of longing and a pain so deep it mirrored her own. He had been starving, she realized, just as she had. Starving for a touch that was not born of duty or pity, but of a shared and desperate need. When his lips met hers, it was not the gentle, questioning kiss she had imagined and feared on the night of the storm. It was a kiss of raw, unshielded hunger, the collision of two souls who had been wandering in a desolate wilderness and had finally found an oasis. It was clumsy and urgent, tasting of salt and sorrow and a desperate, burgeoning hope. Her hands, which had been resting on his chest, tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting to erase the last fraction of an inch that separated them. This was not the calculated intimacy of Julian Croft, a performance meant to lead to an inevitable conclusion. This was a messy, human, and overwhelming communion. They shed their clothes with frantic, fumbling hands, not out of practiced seduction, but with the urgency of two people trying to shed their own skins, to get closer to the truth of each other. His calloused hands, which she had seen mend fences and deliver brutal justice, mapped the lines of her body with a trembling, desperate tenderness. He explored her scars, both visible and invisible, not as imperfections, but as the testament of her survival. And she, in turn, met his desperate hunger with her own. She touched the hard, knotted muscles of his back, the body that had carried so much grief in silence. She kissed the place on his shoulder where an old injury had left a puckered scar. They were two broken things, finding solace in the sharp edges of each other. It was a coming together that was both tender and violent, a frantic reclaiming of the life and feeling that had been stolen from them. They moved together with the rhythm of the storm, a raw and elemental dance of need and comfort, their whispered moans lost to the shriek of the wind. They were not smiling. They were not performing. They were finally, shatteringly real. Clara awoke to a world of unsettling quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pale, washed-out dawn. The first thing she felt was the solid warmth of Elias's body spooned behind her, his arm draped protectively over her waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against her neck. The second thing she felt was a cold, sickening wave of panic. The harsh light of morning brought with it the ghosts of the past. What had she done? She had traded one form of servitude for another. She had given the last piece of herself to a man who had hired her for a performance. The tenderness of the night seemed like a dream, a foolish fantasy. In the light of day, she was still Clara Hale, the fallen woman. And he was Elias McCrae, the grieving widower who had needed a shield, not a wife. Guilt and a familiar, bitter shame washed over her. She had mistaken desperation for affection. She began to tremble. Elias stirred behind her, his grip on her tightening as if he could feel her pulling away in spirit. "Clara," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. She could not answer. A sob caught in her throat. She had broken the rules, her own and his. She had allowed herself to feel, and now the consequences were crashing down on her. He gently turned her to face him. In the gray morning light, his eyes were clear, his expression unclouded by the shadows of the night before. He saw the fear in her eyes, the shame that was already building a wall between them. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft. "This was a mistake," she whispered, pulling the sheet up to her chin, a flimsy shield against his gaze. "The contract. This was not part of the agreement." A flicker of pain crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, steady resolve. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch unwavering. "Clara, look at me!" He waited until her terrified eyes met his. "The agreement was about surviving. That is what we did last night. We survived. Together." He paused, his gaze intense. "I know what you are thinking. I know what he made you believe about yourself, But you do not belong to your past anymore. You do not belong to him. Do you understand me?" His words were a lifeline thrown into the churning sea of her fear. He was not rejecting her. He was claiming her, not as property, but as a partner in survival. The tears that had been threatening now fell freely, silent tracks of relief and a terrifying, fragile hope. He held her tightly, tucking her head under his chin, and let her cry until the panic subsided, leaving behind a profound and quiet stillness. In the arms of this silent, grieving man, she felt the first, tentative seeds of safety begin to take root in the barren soil of her heart. The town of Redemption did not share their sense of peace. Word of the church elder's visit had spread like wildfire, and when Elias and Clara rode into town a few days later, they were met with a wall of hostile silence and sanctimonious glares. Their private world had been breached, and the judgment was swift and absolute. The story that took root was a twisted version of the truth, that the reclusive widower had not hired a wife, but had brought a city prostitute to his home, and they were living in open, flagrant sin. The fact that they were legally married was an inconvenient detail that was quickly discarded in favor of the more scandalous narrative. The final summons came a week later, delivered by a grim-faced boy from the church. They were to attend a formal hearing. The town council and the church elders would sit in judgment, and the community would bear witness. It was not a request, it was a command. The church was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. They sat in the front pew, a solitary island in a sea of condemnation. The air was thick with hypocrisy and the scent of dust and cheap perfume. Reverend Miller presided, his face a mask of smug piety. "Elias McCrae," the Reverend began, his voice booming in the silent church. "You were brought into this community, a man of God, yet you have brought a woman of unknown character into our midst, and, by all appearances, are living in sin, a disgrace to the memory of your late, sainted wife." Elias stood up, his movements calm and deliberate. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Reverend, this is a legal certificate of marriage, signed by a judge in Cheyenne. Clara is my wife before the law and before God. There is no sin." He handed the certificate to the Reverend, who glanced at it with disdain before passing it to the mayor. A murmur went through the crowd. This was a complication to their tidy narrative of condemnation. But Reverend Miller was not so easily deterred. "A piece of paper does not make a moral union," he thundered, his voice ringing with theatrical outrage. "This document may satisfy the laws of man, but it does not satisfy the laws of God. We have heard testimony, stories of this woman's past, a past of vice and impropriety in the city. Such a woman is not fit to be a wife in a decent, God-fearing community. We declare her unfit." A chorus of self-righteous amens echoed from the pews. Clara felt the world begin to shrink, the air growing thin. It was happening again. The same verdict, the same public humiliation. Her hands grew cold, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She felt Elias's hand find hers, his grip strong and steady. He was her anchor, holding her in place, refusing to let her be swept away. She looked at the faces in the crowd. The women, their lips pursed in judgment, some of whom she knew purchased whiskey in secret from the back of the mercantile. The men, their eyes full of a leering, sanctimonious curiosity, some of whom she had seen stumbling out of the saloon's back rooms on her trips to town. The hypocrisy was a suffocating stench. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but the chains of fear and shame that had kept her silent for so long. She stood up, her movement so sudden it startled the Reverend into silence. She was trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and cold as a winter river. "Unfit," she said, the word a quiet challenge in the cavernous room. She looked directly at Reverend Miller. "You declare me unfit, you who have never spoken a single word to me, you who know nothing of my life but the vicious whispers of cowardly men." She turned her gaze to the crowd. her eyes sweeping over the shocked faces. "You want a confession? Then you shall have one. I confess that I was a girl who trusted a man. A powerful man. A man whose name you would recognize. A man who sits on the boards of banks and builds railroads. His name is Julian Croft. I confess that he promised me marriage, and I believed him. And when I would not become the private entertainment for his friends, he destroyed me. He and his powerful friends whispered that I was a woman of loose morals. And you, people just like you, believed them. Because it is always easier to believe the worst of a woman than to question the honor of a powerful man." A shocked silence fell over the church. A few of the women had the decency to look ashamed. Others stared back with cold, hard sneers. Clara was not finished. Her voice grew stronger, ringing with the fire of a long-suppressed truth. "You talk of sin. You wish to cast me out. But I have looked into the eyes of the men in this town. I have seen the same hunger, the same hypocrisy that I saw in the city. The only difference is that here, you hide it behind a prayer book on Sundays. You want to judge me for surviving the only way I knew how. Then you are not a community of God. You are a pack of wolves, dressed in sheep's clothing." She sat down, her heart hammering against her ribs, her body shaking with the adrenaline of her own defiance. The silence in the church was absolute, a thick, ringing void. Some of the women were openly weeping now, touched by the raw honesty of her pain. Others, like the preacher's wife, looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Elias's hand squeezed hers, his knuckles white. He did not look at her, but kept his gaze fixed on the Reverend, a silent, unwavering challenge. Through it all, he held her hand. That night, the town gave its final verdict. They were asleep when the smell of smoke jolted them awake. Elias was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers. "The barn," he said, his voice a low, guttural curse. They burst out of the house into a scene from hell. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring orange inferno against the black velvet of the night sky. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning hay and old wood. Clara stared in horror, her mind struggling to process the scene, all their winter feed, the tools, the structure that was the heart of the ranch's operations. All of it was being devoured by the fire. And then a single, soul-crushing thought pierced through her shock. The piano, her sanctuary, her last connection to the girl she had been, the one part of her past that was truly hers. It was in there, being turned to ash. "No!" she whispered, the word a strangled sound of denial. Before Elias could react, she broke into a run, sprinting toward the side door of the barn, which was not yet fully engulfed. "Clara, no!" Elias screamed, his voice raw with terror. But she did not listen. An instinct deeper than reason was driving her. She could not let them take this from her. Too. She pulled her shawl over her mouth and plunged into the choking smoke. The heat was unbearable, a living thing that seared her lungs. The roar of the fire was deafening. Through the swirling black smoke and the terrifying crackle of burning timbers, she saw it. The piano stood against the far wall, the wood already blistering from the heat. She ran to it, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She put her shoulder to it and pushed. It was impossibly heavy. She strained, every muscle screaming in protest, but it barely budged. A section of the loft above her groaned, ready to collapse. She was going to die here, for a piece of wood and wire. Suddenly, strong arms were around her, pulling her back. It was Elias, his face a mask of fury and terror, his shirt already smoldering. "Are you mad?" he roared, dragging her toward the door. "The piano!" she screamed, fighting against him. He did not hesitate. He released her, shoved her toward the exit, and yelled, "Get out!" Then he turned back, braced himself against the burning instrument, and with a great, primal roar of effort, heaved it toward the door. The old casters screeched, and the piano began to move. Together, They pushed it through the doorway and out into the relative safety of the night just as the loft collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. They stumbled away from the inferno, collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. Elias pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, his body trembling with the aftermath of terror. He held her face in his hands, his eyes wild in the flickering firelight. "I thought I had lost you," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from her soot-stained face to the roaring fire and back again. A strange, fierce light entered his eyes, a look of awe and profound understanding. He gently brushed a stray ash from her cheek. "You are not fragile," he whispered, his voice full of a raw, ragged wonder. "You are fire." They did not go back into the house. They sat on the cool earth, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the barn burn until it was a skeleton of charred timbers against the rising sun. They had lost almost everything. They were outcasts, but they were not defeated. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, he led her away from the smoldering ruins, out into the open land, to a small, sheltered hollow by the creek. The air was cool and clean. He spread the blanket on the damp earth and pulled her down beside him, there, under the vast, open sky. Free from the judgment of walls and rules, they came together again. It was not the desperate, hungry coupling of the storm. It was slow, tender, and triumphant. It was the quiet, deliberate act of two survivors claiming their small patch of the world, a promise made not in a church, but on the sacred, unforgiving land that was now, finally, their own. The ashes of the barn were a black, skeletal wound on the landscape. For 2 days after the fire, a funereal silence hung over the ranch, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the charred timbers. But on the third morning, Elias rose before the sun, his face set in a grim, unyielding line. He took up a shovel and began to clear the debris. It was a monumental task, an act of defiance against the ruin. This time, however, he was not alone. Clara was there beside him, her hands, which were made for piano keys, now gloved and gripping a pitchfork. They worked in a synchronized, unspoken rhythm, clearing away the remnants of the past. The labor was grueling, but in the shared sweat and grime, a new foundation was being laid, one that had nothing to do with wood or stone. One afternoon, as they paused, leaning on their tools and surveying the cleared ground, Clara spoke, her voice thoughtful. "When you rebuild it, it does not have to be the same." Elias looked at her, his brow furrowed. "It was a good barn." "It was your barn," she corrected gently. "Built for one man's life. But our life is different." She picked up a stick and began to sketch in the dirt. "If we put the main doors here, facing east, the morning sun will light the whole space. And if we build the stalls wider, with a high window for each, the air will move better in the summer." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an architect's vision. "It could be stronger, smarter, a place for a future, not just a memory of the past." He looked from the drawing in the dirt to her soot-streaked, earnest face. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. He had spent 2 years clinging to the past, a ghost in his own life. Clara, who had been so haunted by hers, was the one showing him how to build a future. From that day on, the design was theirs. He brought the muscle and the knowledge of wood. She brought the vision and a surprising, practical intelligence. The new barn rose from the ashes, not as a monument to what was lost, but as a testament to what they were building together. As the structure took shape, so did a new purpose within Clara. Her piano, saved from the fire, sat in the main room of the house, a silent, hulking presence. One day, watching a group of young girls walking home from the one-room schoolhouse, their faces a mixture of boredom and aimless energy, an idea sparked. That afternoon, she tacked a small, neatly lettered sign to the post outside the mercantile. "Piano lessons, for the girls of Redemption, no charge." The town's reaction was hesitant. The first week, no one came. The hearing and the fire had left a scar on the community. And while Clara's speech had swayed some, others remained suspicious. But then, a quiet rancher's wife, whose daughter Lizzie was a shy, withdrawn child, appeared at their door. "I heard your speech in the church," the woman said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "And I think my Lizzie could use a little music in her life." Lizzie was the first. Soon, another girl came, then two more. Clara's small house, once a bastion of silence and grief, filled with the stumbling, hesitant notes of childhood scales. She discovered a passion not for performing, but for teaching. She was patient and kind, coaxing melodies from clumsy fingers. She was not merely teaching them to play. She was giving them a language for the feelings they did not have words for, a gift no one had ever given her. Quietly, without fanfare, she was transforming from McCrae's city woman into Mrs. McCrae, the piano teacher. She was reclaiming her identity on her own terms. The true turning point came one afternoon during a lesson with Lizzie, the girl who had slowly begun to blossom under Clara's tutelage. Seemed particularly troubled. After several mistakes, she burst into tears. Clara stopped the lesson, putting a comforting arm around the girl's shoulders. "What is it, dear?" she asked gently. "It is just," Lizzie whispered, her voice trembling. "I am so glad they are gone." "Who is gone?" "Those men," the girl confided, her voice dropping lower. "The ones who were with Mr. Finch. One of them. He used to wait for me on the path from school. He would say ugly things. I was so scared. But after they drowned, he was gone." She looked up at Clara, her young eyes full of a terrible, adult understanding. "My ma says you were brave in the church, that you stood up to them. I think you saved me." The confession, in its simple, childish honesty, was a thunderclap. Lizzie's mother, who had come to collect her daughter, overheard the last part from the doorway, her face paling. The story did not spread like wildfire, but like a slow, deep-running current. It was whispered from mother to mother over sewing circles and laundry lines. The narrative of Clara as a dangerous homewrecker crumbled, replaced by a new, more powerful story. Clara as a protector of their own. The women who had sneered now offered quiet, respectful nods when she came to town. The community had not forgotten her past, but they were beginning to see her present. Sheriff Brody rode out a few weeks later, finding Elias fitting a window into the new barn. He dismounted and watched the work for a moment, a look of grudging respect on his face. "The council has officially closed the investigation into the deaths of Finch and his associates," the sheriff said, his voice flat. He kicked at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. "The coroner's report says drowning. There is no proof of anything else." He looked up and met Elias's gaze, his eyes holding a weary, man-to-man understanding. "There is just justice. Keep your head down. McCrae." He nodded once, turned, and rode away, leaving the final word on the matter to hang in the clean, pine-scented air. With the ranch rebuilding and her place in redemption slowly solidifying, Clara felt a final, nagging piece of her past pulling at her. She needed to close the last door herself. She told Elias she had to take a trip, that there was a ghost she needed to lay to rest. She saw the question in his eyes, but he did not ask it. He simply nodded and said, "I will be here when you get back." The trust in his voice was a greater gift than any passionate declaration. The journey back to the city was like traveling to a foreign country. The noise, the crowds, the towering buildings that blocked out the sky, it all felt oppressive and alien after the vast, open spaces of Wyoming. She found Julian Croft in his opulent office, a place of polished mahogany and smug self-assurance. He looked up when she entered, a flicker of surprise followed by a cool, dismissive amusement. "Clara," he said, as if greeting a long-forgotten acquaintance. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? The girl she had been would have trembled, would have wept or raged, but the woman who now stood before him was forged of prairie fire and a love as solid as the earth. She looked at him, at his expensive suit and his perfectly manicured hands, and felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. "I did not come for an apology. Julian," she said, her voice calm and steady. "An apology from you would be as worthless as your promises. I did not come to demand justice, because I have learned that men like you are insulated from such things." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I came to tell you that you don't own the ending to my story. You are a chapter, a painful, humiliating chapter, but you are not the whole book. The rest of it is mine to write." She turned and walked out, leaving him sitting behind his massive desk, for the first time in his life, utterly speechless. She did not look back. She walked out of the building, out of the city, and did not stop until she was on the train, heading west, toward the wide sky and the man who was waiting for her. When she returned, Redemption was preparing for its annual Harvest Festival. Her piano students, in a gesture of astonishing community acceptance, had insisted that she perform at the town hall. The thought filled her with a familiar, cold dread. The ghost of performances passed, but when she saw the hopeful faces of the girls and felt Elias's quiet, steady hand on the small of her back, she agreed. The town hall was filled to bursting. As she walked to the piano, a hush fell over the room. The faces looking back at her were no longer hostile or leering. They were curious, respectful. She sat down, her hands hovering over the keys. She took a deep breath, and then she began to play. The music that flowed from her was not for them. It was for her. It was the story of her journey, a melody that began with the sorrow of a city's betrayal, that swelled with the fury of a prairie storm, that softened with the quiet tenderness of a healing touch, and that finally resolved into a chord of profound, unshakable peace. She played without shame, without fear, her heart open and her past redeemed, not by their forgiveness, but by her own strength. When the last note faded, the silence held for a beat, and then the room erupted in applause. Elias stood at the back, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not clap. He simply watched her, and on his rugged, weathered face was an expression of such fierce pride and silent, overwhelming love that it was more powerful than any ovation. That night, she found him by the riverbank, skipping stones across the moonlit water. It was the place where the new life of the ranch began, where the water flowed clean and constant. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his strong back. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the gentle murmur of the river and the vast, quiet breathing of the land. She turned him to face her, her hands resting on his chest, over the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. She looked up into his eyes, her own reflecting the light of the moon. "I came here to smile," she whispered, her voice full of a soft, wondrous clarity. "That was the contract, a fake smile for a safe roof." She leaned in, her lips brushing his. "But I stayed to Moan, for all the pain we shared, for the truth we had found in the dark." Her hand came up to cup his face, her touch now full of a quiet, confident love. And to love. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which she was. Clara rested her head on his chest, closing her eyes as the Wyoming moonlight washed over them. Her smile, for the first time, was not a performance. It was a reflection of the peace that had finally settled in her soul. Her voice was steady, and her heart, at long last, was safe. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.